Good afternoon, students. So today we are going to start with the next topic, which is called double fertilization. Okay, so yesterday we have generally completed the structure of the male gametophyte, female gametophyte, and also we have seen the structure of an anatrophous ovule. Okay, so before starting with the double fertilization, let me clear you one point that double fertilization is the characteristic feature of the angiospermic plant. Right, so you know what are angiosperms? Angiosperms are the plants which are generally called as highly flowering plant, and in that we generally see this type of a peculiar characteristic feature that is generally called double fertilization. Okay, so you know basically what do you mean by fertilization? Fertilization is a type of a process where there is a male gamete and a female gamete which fuses with each other to form a diploid zygote. That process is generally called as fertilization, right? But here we are going to study the topic which is so called as double fertilization, right? So double fertilization says that there are two male gametes, right? Okay, so out of two male gamete, one of the male gamete fuses with the egg cell and another male gamete fuses with the secondary nucleus. As the fertilization takes place twice, it is called as double fertilization. Right, okay, now this double fertilization for the very first time was been generally discovered or studied by the scientist Navasdin in Lilium mortagen plant. Right, Lilium mortagen is a flowering plant, and in that the double fertilization for the very first time was been studied. Right, okay, so let's start the procedure. Let's start the mechanism of double fertilization. So before starting with the mechanism, I would like to introduce one word that is called pollination. Right, so you know very well what do you mean by pollination, right? The transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the respective flower is generally called as pollination, right? So you know pollen grain is generally present inside the anther, right? And the female part is generally called as the stigma. Now what happens is that during pollination, the pollen grain from the anther generally gets transferred to the stigma of the respective flower, which is generally called as pollination. So during pollination, the pollen grain comes and gets deposited on the stigma of the flower. Right, now once the pollen grain goes and gets deposited on the stigma of a flower, it starts absorbing a sugary compound. That sugary compound is generally called as pectocellulose. Right, we all know that stigma is sticky in nature, but why stigma is sticky in nature? Because it generally contains a sugary compound which is generally called as pectocellulose. Right, now second step says that, right, once the pollen grain gets deposited on the stigma of the flower, right, okay, the pollen grain generally divides and it leads to the formation of a pollen tube carrying two male gametes and the tube cell nucleus. Right, we have studied in the development of the male gametophyte that whenever there is a formation of a pollen tube, the pollen tube generally contains two male gametes and the tube cell nucleus. Right, now that pollen tube containing your two male gametes, you can see this is the first male gamete and this is the second male gamete. Right, okay, so the pollen tube carrying two male gametes and the tube cell nucleus will now enter the entire length of the style and it will reach to the micropylar end. Right, okay, so you know very well this is stigma, this is the style. Right, so the pollen tube carrying two male gametes and your tube cell nucleus will enter through the entire length of the style and it will reach towards the terminal end of the micropyle. Right, now what happens is that once the pollen tube is ready, right, now the entry of the pollen tube will take place towards the female gamete. Right, this is your pollen tube carrying two male gametes and it will enter towards the female gamete, but via three important passages. Right, first one is that sometimes the pollen tube gets entered through the micropylar end. Right, okay, so the entry of the pollen tube carrying the two male gametes through the micropyle is generally called as progamy. Right, pro is first and gamy is marriage. Right, so the entry of the pollen tube takes place carrying two male gametes through the micropylar end, that is generally called as progamy. Second, sometimes what happens is that the pollen tube generally carrying two male gametes enters through the integument. You know, these are the outermost protective covering of the nucellus is called as integument. Right, so what happens is that this pollen tube will come and it will enter through the integument towards the female gamete. The entry of the pollen tube through the integument is generally called as mesogamy, right? And sometimes also the pollen tube carrying two male gametes directly enters through the chalazal end, right? So the entry of the pollen tube carrying the male gamete towards the female gamete with the help of the chalazal end is called chalazogamy, right? So three passages. One is generally called micropyle, that is called progamy. If there is an entry of pollen tube through the micropyle, it is called progamy. If there is an entry of pollen tube through the integument, it is called mesogamy. And if there is an entry of pollen tube through the chalazal end, it is generally called chalazogamy, right? Okay, now you know very well these are your non-motile male gametes. How are the male gametes? The male gametes are non-motile. They are not going to show any kind of a movement, right? So the movement of non-motile male gametes towards the female gamete, but with the help of the pollen tube, right? Now what is going to take place is that this non-motile male gamete will start moving towards the female gamete, but they are generally carried with the help of what? They are generally carried with the help of the pollen tube. So the process where there is a movement of non-motile male gamete towards the female gamete with the help of the pollen tube is generally called as syphinogamy. Syphinogamy is the process where there is a movement of the non-motile male gametes towards the female gamete with the help of the pollen tube, where siphon stands for pollen tube, right? Now what happens is that the synergid cells, you know very well, the egg cell is in the central and the two flank cells are generally called as the synergid cell, right? Now the synergid cell generally contains the filiform apparatus, right? The filiform apparatus of the synergids will provide a proper passage for the entry of the pollen tube towards the female gamete, correct? Isn't it? So now what will happen is that on piercing the nucellus, right? On piercing the nucellus, now the pollen tube will enter or penetrate inside the embryo sac, right? Now the pollen tube is ready. So through the micropyle, it will help in piercing the nucellus, and the pollen tube carrying two male gametes will now enter into the embryo sac, right? Now the first male gamete goes and fertilizes with the egg cell. This is the central cell which is called egg cell. So the first male gamete goes and fertilizes with what? Goes and fertilizes with the egg cell. Even this male gamete is haploid in nature. Even this egg cell is haploid in nature. So whenever the first male gamete goes and fertilizes with the egg cell, it leads to the formation of a diploid zygote. It leads to the formation of a diploid zygote. This process where the first male gamete fuses with the egg cell to form a diploid zygote is called as syngamy or first fertilization, right? Now the second male gamete will enter and it will fuse with the secondary nucleus. It will fuse with the secondary nucleus. Okay, now the second male gamete, it is also haploid in nature, but we know the nature of the secondary nucleus. Secondary nucleus is diploid in nature. Secondary nucleus is diploid in nature. So the second male gamete goes and fertilizes with the secondary nucleus to form triploid primary endosperm nucleus. To form triploid. Triploid means this haploid male gamete and this diploid secondary zygote will lead to the formation of a triploid primary endosperm nucleus. So the second process is generally called second fertilization or triple fusion. That is the process where the second male gamete goes and fuses with the secondary nucleus to form a triploid primary endosperm nucleus is generally called as second fertilization or triple fusion. So now you can see that the fertilization has taken place twice, right, at two different places. That is, first male gamete goes and fertilizes with the egg cell to form a zygote. Second male gamete goes and fertilizes with the secondary nucleus to form the triploid primary endosperm nucleus. As the fertilization takes place twice at two different places, one at the egg cell, second at the secondary nucleus, the process is generally called double fertilization, right? So this is the mechanism through which the double fertilization takes place in the flowering plant. Now let's talk about the significance of double fertilization. Number one, that is, double fertilization is the only characteristic feature of the angiosperm. That is, all the highly flowering plants generally show the method of double fertilization. The second point, the diploid condition of the zygote is maintained. Whatever the zygote is formed by the egg cell, that diploid condition of the zygote will be restored, right? Third point, that is nothing but the endosperm, which is generally formed, provides nourishment to the developing embryo sac, right? This is the embryo sac. So for the development of the embryo sac, the endosperm is generally going to provide the nourishment. And the seeds which are generally formed, fourth point, the seeds which are generally formed generally shows higher percentage of germination. It means the seeds which are generally formed and during this double fertilization shows the higher viability of the seed germination. And fifth point, here the variations can be seen. In the double fertilization, the variations can be seen. So this is the topic called double fertilization taking place in the angiospermic plant. Thank you very much.